Welcome to the PharmaSource podcast. Today's episode is an in-depth interview with Fred Turco, Vice President of Enterprise Indirects and Sustainable Sourcing Lead at Pfizer. We explore some of Fred's approaches to organisational and operational design, the people, processes and platforms he's putting in place to make procurement a trusted advisor. And we also discussed how they're making progress towards Pfizer's public commitment of net zero by 2040. I hope you enjoy the interview. Fred, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Luke. Really happy to be here today.
Why don't we start off then talking about your experience and how you moved up the ranks within Pfizer? One of your first roles there was with responsibility for environmental health and safety. Now, going from an EHS role into procurement isn't the most common of career changes. So I'm interested to learn a bit more about that, how you found that working in EHS and why you moved into procurement.
Yeah, great question, Luke. And let me just take a step back and I think a lot of the learnings through each career function kind of apply to a lot of what procurement needs to do in their function. So I graduated as a marine engineer, which is similar to mechanical engineering. I shipped out as a marine engineer. And then in the first 5 years, I moved to environmental project management into consulting. And then I landed a small environmental health and safety manager role at a aluminum and zinc die cast ingot all the way into finished product manufacturing facility. Great experience, cheap and cheerful, lean and mean organization, and pretty much do all of the roles, including permitting, leadership, all the way down to rolling drums into the trucks to make sure that hazardous waste gets out on time. So great role, great experience. And I parlayed that into an experience with Pfizer. And I started out as an EHS associate, pretty much a reset, right? A bigger organization, much bigger remit. But I started out as an associate at our Pfizer Groton R&D facility, Groton, Connecticut, and grew that responsibility into pseudo engineering, environmental health and safety, more technical, and supported all of our capital projects and the capital project reviews, in particular design standards, others within the organization. Did that reasonably successful and moved that into an R&D global lead. And I support all of the R&D global developed design standards for Pfizer that would build on code and then say Pfizer Plus to mitigate certain risks to our colleagues, others more containment engineering, I would say, than anything else, into scale up, hydrogenation, other process safety type of work. Pretty technical. The first 6 years of my career in Pfizer, 2000, 2006. From there, I got the opportunity to move into a program space, really more on the business. And my key customer then from EHS was commercial. We had a lot of drivers, commercial buildings, other things. It wasn't our manufacturing, wasn't R&D, much less technical, much more business oriented and driven. It was a great pivot in terms of the customer base and the programs I was supporting, and got the opportunity to manage some of our fleet. From there, I got the opportunity to lead our fleet operations, and we merged with Wyeth, and we had a fleet of 44,000 cars in approximately 102 countries. So mostly Salesforce, some management vehicles, others. For folks that have led that program know that you get some learnings quickly when you start to impact someone's car, right? And the operational oversight with the financial. So I had OpEx, CapEx, and a pretty reasonable sized team at that time. In parallel, about a year later, we merged the operations team within Pfizer with the sourcing team or procurement team. So it became one function. So then I had fleet operations and sourcing, and had to make sure I was up to speed on that from a overall background standpoint, and had a fantastic sourcing lead for fleet and others that report into me, and able to grow into that space. And then that led to fleet HR professional services, then legal, other aspects of indirect, to finally where I am now with the majority of the indirect space under my remit within my team. And no more operational responsibility, entirely sourcing for our overall supply chain facilities, CapEx, energy, digital, HR, and legal footprint within Pfizer.
Which is a huge chunk of business, I'm sure. Which of the categories within that take up the most of your time?
I think some of it is internal maturity, some of it's external maturity. So if you ask me during COVID, it was supply chain, everything to do with service continuity, and then with the recent wars and other geopolitical issues, energy, right, recently, and then that's now stabilized. And we've had an organizational change. So the digital space and HR is coming back to me. And so I wouldn't say it takes up my time because of need. It takes up my time because I need to get closer to the customer. I need to better understand where they're going. And I think that's an important aspect of my role as well as my leadership team's role is really understanding the customer need, what they have now and where they're going, and make sure we have a good sourcing plan to help enable that. So that's where I'm spending some time, is more the newer space from a customer standpoint. But overall, I'm pretty blessed with a fantastic team. So I'd say there's not a lot of hot spots.
Great. So over that time then, in moving up the ranks and taking on more procurement types of responsibilities, interested to know what lessons you've learned along the way about how procurement can be effective across all of these different categories. Do you apply the same approach across most categories, or how have you had to nuance that?
Yeah, I think it's a similar approach, right? Fundamentally, the first is understand the business need, right? Who are the decision makers? Is it a centralized, from a governance, decentralized function, from a decision-making process? Understand that and be able to influence that from a demand side, because it's difficult to have any real significant value if you're not part of that process in demand management, or at least dictating what is going on and applying best practice externally and making sure we have leverage. So that first part is be a trusted advisor, earn our seat at the table, right? It's not, we don't come with our hand up, we don't ask, we earn it by doing, by delivering that value to the customer and earning that trust on an ongoing basis. So a lot of what I would call our category management structure is that customer facing, to define need, define external best practice, if there's a gap assessment, to help drive to that best practice as a trusted advisor and be part of that decision-making process. So that's number one. And I think that's consistent across our categories. I also have the execution at a shop floor level at sites and countries. And then I have some of the central enabling function to help with that as well. But similarly, let's make sure we define decision makers, have stakeholder management, and help drive that to be enhanced for that stakeholder. The second part is to connect the strategy to execution. You can have a good plan, but if you can't execute, then you're just dreaming. And if you execute without a plan, you're wandering, right? So it's that middle ground of how do we get a good plan that fundamentally demonstrates we know how to execute, we know what our baseline is, and to drive that going forward. And then once we have that, we execute flawlessly. We drive that execution all the way through. It could be change management, it could be an aggregation of spend, could be a disaggregation based on risk, other factors. But from a strategy to execution, we have to connect those dots and drive the outcomes going forward. And then lastly, communicate and build on success, right? We're all within an organization, or many of us work within a corporation. There's finite resources. And to advocate for that value proposition, the leadership needs to understand, up through my line, which would be the CFO, what that value is, right? And that we can continue to get that investment within a team to bring that value back to the Pfizer, because there's a good return on investment. So those are my three kind of criteria going through. So I apply that all. And now aspects of that might be in different levels of maturity, that depend upon the customer base, category, our leadership and team, but it's to drive all three of those areas.
Great. And so when you're doing that communication, whether that's to the business leaders or up to the CFO, what types of value are they looking for? The same types of metrics, or is it different types of value, different types of outcomes?
It's different types of outcomes. So indirect space, unlike directs, they have an advantage. Directs is in our cost of goods sold. Indirect is mostly overhead, right? But you can still have the same financial outcomes in terms of driving that efficiency. Approximately a third of our savings, for instance, is P&L. Easy to dictate. 2/3 of it is cost avoidance, other savings, risk mitigation that we monetize, right? So we don't get into the, how valid is this game, right? We want to get into with the business owner where we actually drive that cost reduction or risk mitigation, monetarily operating budget or capital budget, and then they have the discretion of what they do with that money. If the CFO wants to bank that as a cost reduction, that's up to the CFO and that budget owner. For us, we're just driving that value to them, and that allows us to be a better trusted advisor. So on the savings side, it's always very clear. We are driving the savings for them and their discretion of how to use that money. Now, I know other organizations are different. I love the way we do it because I am not a police person of savings. I'm just driving the savings through engagement and having what we call as one Pfizer voice with the suppliers and others, and to make sure we get a most competitive product. Now, we are not lowest cost oriented. We're generally very value, quality of service for cost of service with the appropriate risk mitigation. But within that, we'll drive that number. Working capital, cash flow is another very easy one from a financial metric standpoint that will help drive. And then supplier diversity, we drive, and we normalize that based on percentage, right? So our customer is very keen on that. So if his spend is down or up, we're looking to continually align on the target and drive that. And then similar to net zero, we'll drive. So those are the kind of the what criteria. More functionally, we look at things like cycle time, sourcing programs. We put things into high, medium, and low complexity, and then drive the cycle time improvement on that going forward for contracting and sourcing. Now, that's a shared goal across our function, but also other functions like legal, et cetera. But again, the idea is speed to value. How do we drive that as an organization? So we communicate that out to our stakeholders. There's an alignment there that they're looking for this. But we also say that this is a shared commitment because we need your decision in this process for an RFP or others to go forward. So I think being transparent, being very direct, establishing a baseline and the baseline improvement across key criteria that are business oriented, I think that's appropriate, not just functional. And that's allowed us to continue to have that seat at the table in our communications. We have a base, kind of the what, the how, and then the who that we report out on regularly to our customer. And then we'll put the anecdotal project information so they have that in kind of further clicks. So that's our base communication pack on a quarterly basis. And then we build on that with each customer in our kind of one-to-one or one-to-many dialogue.
Okay. You're working across various different departments, different parts of the business. And then within your own team, you mentioned you've got your local teams, got your centralized center of excellence team as well. What are your thoughts around organizational design and what have you been doing around how to sort of make changes to that, to optimize it, and also the role of technology underpinning that? Where are you at with that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think a lot of people focus on organizational design. And the reality is, if we take a step back, I think it's the operational design with organization, which is your people, how they're situated, what are the roles, how do those roles interface with others, how do you develop good role descriptions with ownership and clear ownership for that, what are the processes that cut across, and how much can you standardize those processes when we're, my team supports right around 85 countries and about 300 facilities around the globe. So standardization of those processes to enable the people to be successful and continuously successful. And then lastly, the platforms or the system. So I call that the 3 Ps. So to get to a good operating model, you have to have balance and cohesion between all 3 Ps, the people, the processes, and the platforms. So for instance, we're rolling out a new data lake spend management tool and an AI capable contracting platform. All fantastic functionality, but independently, it's not going to work very well if our processes aren't further harmonized, standardized, and our people don't understand the roles and decision rights relative to the roles and operating within that. Not only us, but also legal, other functions to make sure we're aligned. So we've spent a lot of time on role clarity and making sure people understand what they own. They have the capability training associated with that. Not only that, they're able to articulate and others understand what that role is. So that could be, we call our local team business engagement, a BE team. So they own the local customer oriented. So if we can roll out a sourcing plan globally or regionally, then maybe it gets executed locally and they're part of the execution. If we can't roll it out globally or regionally and it has to be local because of statutory or some other requirements, then they'll end up driving that. So generally, but they own that customer interface locally for strategy to execution. The category management team owns the overall global regional stakeholders in decision making, budget owners, and a lot of our spend is aggregated to that space, and they're also customer facing. So we have two customer facing teams centrally and then locally to make sure we go from strategy to execution across our continuum. The enabling group is kind of the interface between all of them, and that group owns process, and we call that category execution.
Okay.
And they own the process across each team to make sure RFPs are done consistently, our contracting is done consistently. We bring in other teams for their support, including legal, and that's done on a consistent basis. So this kind of federated model of defining the why, the what, and enabling the how allows us to consistently go forward and then use new tools like the data lake, which will improve our spend quality and data, and the contracting platform.
Are you all on a similar tech infrastructure at the moment? Those 85 countries, 300 facilities. I mean, are they all plugging into one ERP, for example?
We have one ERP with different instances, but we have one ERP, which is as a benefit. But what I like about the new data lake and the spend management tool is the problem with sometimes with the ERP is that junk in is junk out. So what I mean by that, material coding, others with our purchase recs, if they use the wrong material code and it's kind of labeled the wrong way, then our spend data will always be a little bit flawed. And you have to go through and do pretty significant manual cleanup, and that scales significantly. What I like about this is it actually takes flawed data and then makes sense of it. So in other words, we're assuming that you're always going to give us flawed data. We're going to put that into a data lake with an algorithm and continue based on your input of, I've sorted it this way, algorithm, is this right? And you verify that. And every time we verify that, we improve the algorithm. We improve the quality of the data and we reduce the amount of manual cleanup. So I think that is an awesome, we've spent so much time on the front end, which from an engineering you typically would, but that's so people oriented. And we have such a turnover of our people that now we can clean up the front end as to the extent we can, but make sure that we have a system that operates within that. But we are in one ERP, multiple instances. We have some exceptions to that because of merger acquisition, but majority of it's on one ERP.
Great. So when you're rolling out this type of initiative, how are you going to get everyone adopting? There's always an adoption gap, isn't there, with any technology when you roll it out?
I think when you roll this out, it's a crawl, walk, run. You have to have the primary purpose and kind of centrally enabled, and then you have to push that out. So for us on the data lake side, that's run by a core team, not my team. Team I leverages from procurement that's running all of our management systems that go back into the ERP. So they're running that from a core. I have team representatives on a limited duration team with a two-way responsibility to make sure the input from the team is fed into the core team. And then that's considered in the scale up of that data lake spend analytics tool. That will be rolled out Q1 this year in full training to the function. And then we'll open that up to other power users in the rollout there. So there'll be this systematic kind of crawl, walk, run ramp up of that. So I don't expect a lot of training or others, but there are other tools that have more significant customer impact. That's a kind of an enhancement from our function, and others, finance, others will have value there. So they'll be pulling the rope. Other tools where we need the customer to do more for themselves. So I have an intake process, sourcing and contracting. If you need support, we had about 4,000 requests last year for support within the remit of my team. And that initial intake, majority of it is 92% of it is customer derived. The other is functional, where we have on the behalf of functionality. But to do that, it's a pretty significant training and change management. And there is a roadshow and then the refresher training and others to make sure people are asking it in an appropriate way, that it's not too burdensome for them. And what we say is get the right work to the right people at the right time. We can go through that process of helping them in that view. So that's a pretty extensive change management. We're going to do that again because we're going to revise that tool for the intake process later this year. And we'll have to do a similar rollout to what we did about 2 years ago.
Thank you. Let's talk then about another major aspect of your job, which is on the sustainability side. To start with, what does that mean, being the sustainable sourcing lead at a company as big as Pfizer? I mean, presumably sustainability is now built into everybody's job. Where do you feel like your role starts and ends?
Yeah, it's a good question. And maybe I'm just going to take a step back
Mm,
because I try to, it's kind of like an elephant. You got to break it off in chunks on this one. First of all, sustainable is pretty complex. It's also become also a very political topic,
mhm,
right? And to me, I don't want to get into the fiduciary responsibility, governance policy, some of the accounting or environmental kind of social impact on the why, and to an extent the what, right? We're an enabling function within procurement. I think we have a voice and we are part of the governance for our ESG. However, we do have a role once there is a direction within our organization. So I try to go from I have my own opinions, right, which I think are largely informed, but others get paid to do that within our corporate affairs team, corporate governance, and others. So once Pfizer has a direction on that of what we think is the appropriate direction going forward and how that is in line with our purpose for patients and our values, then I think it's up to us to kind of take a look at, okay, what's the best way of getting there and
mm,
executing? So I try to pick up from there without a lot of the debate prior to, even though I have a view. And then from there, my questions become a little bit easier. Can procurement add value in this space? Sustainability, that is, right? And sustainability for me is, are you leaving more than you take, right? Just very definitionally, are you adding to it rather than just subtracting, or net, are you leaving more than you take?
mm.
And the answer for me in procurement's role is yes, we can add a lot of value in this space, and we should add value in this space. So when you think about what we do as an organization, we work with approximately in Pfizer about 1 trillion USD of suppliers, and that's their revenue.
Hmm.
We have about 45,000 suppliers that represent approximately 1 trillion in USD revenue on an annualized basis. That's clearly we're a percentage of that, a small percentage, generally
Hmm.
1% of that, but it's still a significant number, and we have a significant role in terms of supply chain of driving the demand side, if you think about it from a
Yep.
pure supply chain. So the answer going back of sustainability, it's a pretty complex topic, but it comes down to Pfizer as an organization has defined a direction relative to our values, and then our job is to help with the execution.
And so that direction then is Pfizer's signed up to being net zero by 2040. What are the other important aspects of that overall vision for sustainability?
Well, I'm just going to focus on that. There's our ESG report is public. I would say we are largely bigger player in the S, right? The E is very important, but S is a lot about patient access
Hmm.
to our medicines. And obviously, that is a significant priority. But I'm going to focus on the net zero side because I think that will get to some of your questions because the other aspects are equally important. And I don't want to diminish them by not focusing on them, but I
Hmm.
think I can tease out kind of the procurement role more easily on some of the net zero side. So our
Sure.
public commitment is to Science-Based Target Initiative, which is a third-party non-government organization, and define science-aligned targets and reduction for our scope one, which is the energy that we make on site or through cars, taking a fossil fuel and converting that to energy. So our power plants and the facilities, as well as cars. Then scope two, the electricity that we consume off of the grid for our facilities. And then scope three, everything else.
Hmm.
So in that view, for Pfizer, scope three, the everything else is largely suppliers. And suppliers are approximately 75% of Pfizer's footprint.
So that's those 45,000 suppliers you mentioned.
That's right. So when we think about a public commitment and our ability to get to net zero by 2040 through varying efforts, clearly we have to focus on the supplier side.
So thinking about the supplier emissions and the scope three emissions, what are those main levers that you can pull at? What have you seen as some of the most, successful ways of making progress?
I'm just going to give context here, and I think most procurement organizations will be able to relate to this. If you're going to fix traffic in town, you don't fix the side streets. We focus on Main Street, right? So procurement is very good at segmenting suppliers. We call it our supplier relationship management program, maybe a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, different vernacular, different teams. But largely, there's a few hundred suppliers, in our case, of the 45,000 that dictate the majority, in our case, almost 80% of overall emissions. So the first thing is understanding that and segmenting those suppliers. The good news, I think, for most folks, regardless of emission type, spend correlates well enough to emissions because it's a prorated part of the overall supplier emissions. So you're prorating their emissions to be part of your emissions. And if that being said, spend is a good surrogate initially. So if that's all you have is spend data, you can start and then segment that spend data down into the couple of hundred suppliers that dictate a majority of your overall spend, which will roughly correlate to emissions. Not one for one, but close enough to make an impact. From there, then we have engagement. We actually assessed suppliers on maturity model because we understand some of them don't have a good emission understanding, which is okay because some of that's voluntary. And some of them have a fantastic program, very advanced. And we want to make sure we understand the baseline of all from kind of low maturity, maybe no public commitments or reporting, into very high advanced maturity and very aggressive goals, SBTI or otherwise. So we'd give them a 1 through 5 in our maturity model, and that would be our baseline. And then from that, look to improve that baseline, part of our supplier relationship management program or performance management with suppliers as an ANT. There's your financial SLAs, KPIs, things that you're reporting. And let's include this one as something that we're reporting on a regular basis. If your maturity is 2, get to 3. If it's 3, let's get to 4. And what are the criteria doing that going forward? And how can we help you? So we're defining the what and success criteria of maturity 5 and 4, and then enabling that success with the supplier. That being said, the enablement of success. So we define the what, we measure that via RFPs maturity, via SRM maturity model. We use that in our decision criteria for make a supplier selection. So we've integrated that in. And then lastly, and in parallel, we need to improve on that data. Again, I said spend roughly correlates to emissions. It doesn't wholly correlate. So how do we know the absolute reduction is happening? Well, we're now in the process of taking that same cohort of roughly 400 suppliers and working with them to have them submit their actuals and emissions and then prorate that to Pfizer emissions going forward. And then we'll have that kind of glide path of actuals similar to what we do for our own internal operations. So I think it's a systematic or a management system approach that we've taken, but a lot of it's we're leveraging our strengths, which is supplier segmentation, supplier relationship management, and the fantastic sourcing colleagues we have or procurement colleagues we have within Pfizer.
Very interesting. Are there financial incentives tied to that for the suppliers then? So if they go from, 1 to 2 or 2 to 3?
Yeah, we've debated that quite a bit. I've actually talked about that in conferences. Difficult to tie a financial incentive to it. So it could be a working capital, a cash flow improvement. Others have talked to it. When we looked at a working capital with a payment term, generally the folks that we'd want to give a reduction to didn't drive the needle from an environmental. And then our more substantive, larger suppliers would perhaps, but they're already there in terms of maturity. So, when we looked at that, we said, well, the juice really isn't worth the squeeze in terms of incentive, right? It's something we could do in terms of a cash flow. Everyone is looking at cash flow now. What we've done instead, rather than direct, is to support through Pharmaceutical Environmental Group, PSCI, and other initiatives, cross-industry collaboration. So through PEG, they have stood up a program called Energize. And Energize is run by Schneider Electric as a independent third party, and they will provide free renewable energy training to any of Pfizer suppliers or any other company that signs up to that consortium cross-industry group. So we pay a nominal fee for that annually. And then Energize provides that training, base training, into boot camp all the way through to the suppliers as the suppliers sign up. In addition, there's a consortium buy in Europe and North America opportunity. So when we look at that way we can help them aggregate their own spend, get leverage, and use a professional third party to help move over on what could be maybe a virtual power purchase agreement or some other opportunity.
Interesting.
So we're doing similar on a program called Activate for CMOs to help enable the contract manufacturers, and similarly through industry groups and collaboration and third parties to help them accelerate their journey.
Thank you, Fred. Finally, interested to know what motivates you personally in life, in your work, and helps you to motivate others around you too.
Yeah, I think we all have to have a reason to get up out of bed in the morning. From a professional standpoint, I think the win-win solutions that aren't always easy. A lot of people think procurement is the bad cop in the room, and our job is to beat up on suppliers. My view is more often than not, vastly more often than not, 98% of the time, it's actually how to set up an environment or a framework where suppliers can thrive. And they bring in good, valuable solutions back to us. They want to be successful. We want them to be successful, and mutual success can help both parties in that arrangement. So I think getting to those solutions or helping facilitate that environment from a B2B standpoint, that we are the client of choice, not just the supplier of choice. We're not just looking at one-sided, that they want to work with us, that they want to bring in their ideas, their solutions, innovation, and we can partner with them on certain mutual risk, I think is one key area. The second is people. For me, ultimately, I have a pretty decent sized global team. Our greatest strength is our diversity of location, background, ethnicity, religion, etc. within the team. But also our biggest weakness is our geographic spread, our connectivity, and the ability to get together, especially post-COVID, with travel restrictions and others, and have that kind of trust and bond. So as a leader, looking to leverage that strength, right, and really enhance all of our lives through our engagement activity, but also address and mitigate the weakness through the use of technology and very intentional meetings that are not business related. We have cooking classes, we do other things online on our team that really celebrates the strength. So I think those are the two things, and business solutions and people.
Fantastic. Fred, thank you so much for your time. Absolute pleasure speaking to you today.
Likewise, Luke, I really appreciate it.
Now, before we go, I'd like to mention CDMO Live, a new event from us at PharmaSource. CDMO Live is a new online event designed to connect you with the latest insights and innovative partners in contract manufacturing. We've put together an in-depth program of expert talks and roundtables to help you work with CDMOs to accelerate drug development, decarbonise Scope 3 emissions, and optimise contract manufacturing networks. To find out more, head to pharmasource.global/CDMO Live. Thank you for listening to today's episode.